Most people imagine that an avoidant ex will suddenly wake up one day, realize what they lost, and rush back with overwhelming emotion. In reality, what unfolds inside their mind is rarely dramatic. It is quieter, slower, and driven by complicated psychological patterns that often stay hidden beneath the surface. If you've stopped reaching out to an avoidant, or you're thinking about going completely silent, you're probably wondering whether your absence actually has any effect. The truth is that it absolutely does, but not in the simple way most people expect. Their internal experience moves through several emotional and psychological phases that aren't obvious from the outside. In this video, we're going to explore each stage of what typically happens when you genuinely disappear from an avoidant's life. And toward the end, we'll cover one important insight that almost no one discusses because it shifts the focus away from them and toward your own growth. That final realization is often the one that changes everything. The first thing many avoidants experience is relief, and hearing that can be incredibly painful if you're hoping they're immediately missing you. By now, you probably understand that avoidants often pull away when emotional closeness becomes too intense, so we don't need to revisit that foundation. What matters is what happens once your silence begins. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by emotional demands, their nervous system often relaxes. The pressure they were carrying seems to disappear, allowing them to breathe a little easier. Meanwhile, you're likely living through the exact opposite experience. You're replaying conversations, checking your phone over and over, wondering whether they'll ever reach out while they appear perfectly calm. This doesn't mean you're emotionally weaker or that they never cared. It reflects two completely different attachment systems responding to the same silence in opposite ways. That painful imbalance is what makes no contact feel almost impossible for many people. It isn't a lack of self-control. It's the emotional agony of carrying all the feelings while it seems like the other person is carrying none. The next stage is far less obvious, yet it has a powerful impact. Without realizing it, you've taken away a source of stability they depended on. Many people think avoidants regulate themselves simply by creating distance, but there's another layer to it. They also rely on the comfort of knowing the people they've distanced themselves from are still there, waiting in the background. There is reassurance in believing you'll eventually send another message, check in again, or remain emotionally invested even while they continue withdrawing. That certainty becomes a quiet emotional safety net. It allows them to maintain a connection without having to expose themselves emotionally or take the risk of true vulnerability. As long as they believe you'll remain available, they can keep their distance while still feeling connected on their own terms. When you genuinely disappear, that invisible support system quietly disappears with you, and for the first time, they begin losing something they never consciously realized they depended on. The truth is, your steady presence was the very thing that allowed them to remain emotionally distant without feeling the full consequences of that distance. As long as they believed you would still be there, their withdrawal felt safe and manageable. But when you genuinely stop reaching out, something much deeper changes. You don't simply remove emotional pressure, you take away the invisible foundation that had been quietly supporting their emotional balance. Before they can even identify what has changed, their mind senses that something important is no longer there. It isn't heartbreak or longing at this stage. Instead, it's a subtle but persistent feeling that the structure they unconsciously relied upon has shifted. They can't immediately explain it, but something inside them recognizes that the emotional environment they counted on is no longer stable, and that realization begins creating quiet internal discomfort. The next stage rarely begins with love or regret. It almost always starts with the ego trying to protect itself. Rather than immediately thinking, I miss them, an avoidant's mind often searches for explanations that shield them from vulnerability. Questions like, why haven't they contacted me? Or, did they really move on that quickly? Become much more common than emotional confessions. Beneath those thoughts is a much deeper truth they usually don't recognize. During the relationship, you quietly played an emotional role that became part of their internal stability. You remained understandable, available, and emotionally present even while they kept parts of themselves hidden. Your consistency allowed their avoidance to function without being challenged. Once you disappear, that familiar point of reference disappears too. This is why silence often has a greater psychological impact than emotional conversations ever could. Honest discussions can trigger defensive walls, but your absence removes the very thing those defenses were designed to respond to. Suddenly, there is nothing left for those protective patterns to push against. As more time passes, another psychological shift begins to unfold. Their mind gradually starts revisiting the relationship, but not in the way most people imagine. Research on avoidant attachment suggests that when emotional closeness feels threatening, avoidants don't only suppress painful memories, they also suppress many of the positive experiences connected to the relationship. Moments of comfort, affection, safety, and genuine closeness can all become buried, because allowing themselves to fully experience those emotions feels overwhelming. While you were together, they may never have consciously appreciated just how meaningful your presence actually was, because their nervous system was focused on protecting itself rather than fully receiving the connection. Once enough distance exists and the emotional threat begins to fade, those hidden memories slowly become more accessible. They begin remembering your kindness, your reliability, and the unique sense of peace they experienced around you. This isn't necessarily because they've suddenly matured or transformed. More often, it's simply because their emotional defenses have relaxed enough for feelings that were previously buried to finally reach the surface. This naturally leads to another painful reality. For many avoidants, the emotional impact of losing someone becomes far stronger than the emotional experience of having them. Because attachment feelings were muted while the relationship existed, the true weight of the bond often isn't fully felt until that bond is gone. The sadness, the longing, and the realization of what they truly had may arrive much later than expected. Sometimes those emotions don't appear until you've already rebuilt your life, found peace, or stopped waiting for them altogether. That delayed awareness creates a heartbreaking contrast. While you were fully present, you experienced the relationship with all its emotional intensity in real time. They often experienced only a fraction of it because their protective system kept so much beneath the surface. Then, once your absence becomes permanent, those emotions finally emerge with a force they can no longer avoid. By then, however, the opportunity to repair what was lost may already have quietly slipped away. None of this is meant to encourage you to sit around hoping they'll return. It's simply an explanation of how delayed emotional processing often unfolds for someone with avoidant attachment. Many avoidants don't fully experience the emotional impact of a relationship until long after it has ended. But recognizing what they lost is not the same as becoming capable of building a healthy relationship. That distinction matters more than anything else. They may think about you every day, miss you deeply, and finally understand your value, yet still remain completely unable to create lasting emotional closeness. Insight alone doesn't rewrite old attachment patterns. Without developing the ability to tolerate vulnerability and intimacy, that realization simply becomes unresolved emotional pain. Many avoidants repeat the same relationship cycle over and over, genuinely believing each new attempt will be different. Their intentions may be sincere, and their self-awareness may even be growing, but unless their behaviors change, the outcome usually remains exactly the same. If they eventually come back into your life, don't let yourself be convinced by emotional words alone. Missing you isn't the question that deserves your attention. The real question is whether they have changed the way they show up. Have they become more emotionally available? Do they communicate consistently instead of disappearing? Have they taken responsibility for the patterns that damage the relationship, or are they simply hoping everything will return to the way it was? Real growth isn't measured by apologies or promises. It's measured by repeated actions that demonstrate a different way of relating. Anyone can say they've changed, especially after experiencing loss. Lasting transformation is visible through consistency, accountability, and the willingness to stay emotionally present when things become uncomfortable. Before believing a reunion will be different, pay attention to what has actually changed in their behavior, because actions will always reveal more than words ever can. Now let's step back from their psychology entirely, because the most important lesson in this entire journey has very little to do with them. After a breakup, it's natural to spend weeks or even months trying to understand why they pulled away, why they couldn't choose the relationship, or why your love wasn't enough to make them stay. You replay conversations, analyze every interaction, and wait for the day they finally understand what they lost. But eventually a deeper question begins to emerge, and it's the one that truly transforms your life. Instead of asking why they couldn't choose you, ask yourself why you believed you had to earn love in the first place. That question changes everything because it shifts the focus from their emotional limitations to your own relationship with love, worth, and acceptance. Silence has a remarkable way of revealing patterns that were hidden while you were busy trying to hold the relationship together. It exposes the ways you may have overextended yourself, ignored your own needs, or continuously adjusted your expectations to accommodate someone else's emotional distance. Perhaps somewhere in your past you learned that love had to be earned through endless patience, constant understanding, or proving your value over and over again. That belief, not simply their avoidant behavior, is often what kept you invested long after the relationship stopped meeting your emotional needs. The moment you stop asking, "Why didn't they choose me?" and begin asking, "Why did I believe I needed to work so hard to deserve love?" is the moment real healing begins. One question keeps your attention fixed on someone who may never change. The other leads you back to yourself, where genuine growth happens. And once you do that inner work, you no longer need an avoidant to return in order to feel complete. One of the hardest truths to accept is that emotional timing is not the same for everyone. People with avoidant attachment often experience their emotions on a delay, not because their feelings are fake, but because their mind has learned to postpone emotional processing whenever closeness begins to feel overwhelming. That delay creates confusion for both people. One person is desperately trying to understand what happened while the other appears strangely calm. Then, weeks or even months later, the emotional weight can finally surface for the avoidant. By that point, however, life may have already moved forward. This is why relying on someone else's delayed realization can keep you emotionally stuck. Healing begins when you stop measuring your progress by whether they finally understand your value and start measuring it by how much peace you have created within yourself. It's also important to understand that emotional insight and emotional capacity are two completely different things. Someone can clearly recognize every mistake they made, admit that they hurt you, and sincerely wish things had gone differently. Yet when they find themselves in another emotionally vulnerable situation, they may still respond exactly as they always have. This happens because awareness changes thoughts, but healing changes automatic responses. Real transformation requires learning how to stay emotionally present during discomfort instead of escaping from it. Until someone develops that ability, they often repeat familiar patterns without intending to. That is why meaningful change is never proven by emotional conversations alone. It becomes visible through consistency, accountability, and the willingness to remain connected even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Another pattern many people overlook is how emotional availability slowly reshapes your own sense of worth. When you're constantly trying to understand someone who struggles to express affection, you can gradually begin believing that love is naturally confusing, unpredictable, or something that must be earned through endless patience. Over time, you may stop asking whether your own needs are being met and instead become completely focused on becoming easier to love. That quiet shift can happen without you even noticing it. Instead of expecting mutual effort, you start accepting emotional uncertainty as normal. The longer that pattern continues, the more disconnected you become from your own standards. Real healing isn't just about recovering from one relationship. It's about rebuilding the belief that healthy love doesn't require you to constantly prove your value or sacrifice your emotional security just to keep someone close. As you continue growing, you'll probably realize that the greatest change isn't whether someone comes back. It's how differently you respond if they do. The version of you that once waited for reassurance slowly becomes someone who values consistency over potential. Instead of being persuaded by promises, you begin paying attention to repeated behavior. Instead of chasing emotional availability, you look for people who naturally offer it. That shift may seem subtle, but it changes every relationship that follows. You stop viewing love as something that depends on convincing another person to choose you. Instead, you begin choosing relationships where effort, respect, and emotional openness already exist. That's when silence no longer feels like punishment or uncertainty. It becomes clarity, revealing who is truly capable of meeting you where you are and who is simply repeating patterns they have not yet learned to overcome. There is another piece of this that deserves attention because many people assume that closure only comes when the other person finally explains themselves. But closure rarely arrives through someone else's words. More often, it develops through your own understanding of the relationship. The human mind naturally searches for explanations after emotional loss. It wants certainty because uncertainty feels threatening. That is why people replay conversations, analyze every message, and search for hidden meanings long after the relationship has ended. Yet the more you depend on another person's explanation to move forward, the more your healing remains tied to someone else's emotional readiness. Real closure begins when you accept that not every unanswered question needs an answer to lose its power. Sometimes peace comes from recognizing the pattern itself rather than waiting for the person who created it to finally explain why it happened. It's equally important to remember that attachment patterns are not permanent identities. Avoidant attachment is not a life sentence, nor does it mean someone is incapable of love. It reflects a protective strategy that usually developed over many years through repeated emotional experiences. The problem is that protective strategies only work until they begin damaging the very relationships they were designed to preserve. Real healing becomes possible when someone develops enough self-awareness to recognize those defenses and enough courage to replace them with healthier ways of connecting. That process takes time, honesty, and consistent effort. It cannot be achieved simply because someone experienced a painful breakup or suddenly realized what they lost. Pain may create motivation, but lasting change only happens when that motivation is followed by intentional action over a long period of time. That's why patience with yourself is just as important as understanding someone else's psychology. The most powerful outcome of this entire experience is not learning how to make an avoidant miss you. It's learning how to recognize emotional reciprocity from the very beginning of a relationship. When you become emotionally healthier, your standards naturally begin to change. You stop interpreting inconsistency as mystery or emotional distance as depth. Instead, you begin appreciating reliability, honest communication, and mutual effort, because those qualities create genuine emotional safety. Relationships become less about chasing chemistry and more about building trust. That doesn't make love less exciting, it makes it more sustainable. The healthiest relationships aren't built on uncertainty or emotional highs followed by painful lows. They're built on two people who are both willing to stay present, communicate openly, and work through discomfort together instead of running from it. That is the kind of connection that lasts because neither person has to sacrifice themselves to keep it alive. One of the biggest misunderstandings after an avoidant relationship ends is believing that your silence is a strategy designed to make them return. While silence may eventually cause them to reflect, its greatest value has nothing to do with influencing their behavior. Its real purpose is creating enough emotional distance for your own nervous system to recover. During the relationship, your emotions may have become closely tied to their availability. A delayed reply could affect your mood. Their withdrawal could leave you questioning your worth. Over time, your emotional state may have become dependent on signals coming from someone else. Silence interrupts that cycle. It gives your mind the opportunity to stop reacting to every possibility and begin responding to your own reality instead. That shift doesn't happen overnight, but every day you remain focused on your own healing rather than their next move, you slowly reclaim the emotional stability that was lost in the relationship. As that stability returns, something else begins changing beneath the surface. Your attention gradually moves away from trying to predict another person's behavior and starts becoming curious about your own emotional patterns. You begin noticing the moments when you ignored your intuition, excused repeated inconsistency, or convinced yourself that one more conversation would finally change everything. None of those realizations are meant to create guilt. They create awareness. They allow you to see where your boundaries became flexible and where your desire to preserve the relationship became stronger than your commitment to protecting your own emotional well-being. That kind of self-reflection is incredibly valuable because it transforms painful memories into lasting wisdom. Instead of carrying resentment into your next relationship, you carry greater clarity about what healthy love actually looks like and what you will no longer accept. Eventually, there comes a moment when the relationship stops feeling like an unfinished story. You no longer wake up wondering whether they'll reach out or imagining different endings to the same situation. The emotional intensity slowly gives way to acceptance. You remember the good moments without ignoring the painful ones. You appreciate what the relationship taught you without wishing to return to the version of yourself that settled for emotional uncertainty. That is one of the clearest signs of genuine healing. It isn't that you stop caring completely. It's that your peace is no longer dependent on someone else's choices. Whether they come back, stay silent, or continue repeating the same patterns becomes far less important because your life is no longer waiting for their decision. You've already made your own, and that decision is to choose relationships where love is shared freely instead of constantly being questioned or earned. If this perspective resonated with you and helped you see the situation differently, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more insights on understanding avoidant attachment and building healthier relationships. If there's one idea I hope stays with you after this video, it's this. Your silence was never supposed to be a test for someone else. It was supposed to become a turning point for you. So many people enter no contact believing its purpose is to make an avoidant miss them, regret losing them, or finally realize what they walked away from. And while those things can happen, they are not the outcome that truly changes your life. The real transformation begins the moment your attention shifts away from trying to control another person's emotional journey and back toward your own. Because the truth is, you were never responsible for carrying someone else's emotional growth. You were never meant to convince another person to become ready for intimacy. And you were never meant to sacrifice your own peace while waiting for someone else to discover your worth. The reality is that every relationship reveals something about both people involved. It exposes not only another person's fears, defenses, and emotional patterns, but also your own beliefs about love, acceptance, and self-worth. That's why painful relationships can become some of the greatest teachers you'll ever have if you're willing to learn from them. They show you where your boundaries became blurred, where you ignored your own needs, where you settled for inconsistency because you hoped consistency would eventually appear. None of that makes you foolish, it makes you human. When we love someone deeply, we naturally want to believe that patience, understanding, and unconditional support will eventually bring us closer together. But healthy relationships are never built by one person doing all the emotional work. They grow when two people are equally willing to face discomfort, communicate honestly, and remain emotionally present even when it feels difficult. This is why it's so important to separate compassion from self-sacrifice. You can understand why someone became avoidant without accepting treatment that leaves you emotionally exhausted. You can have empathy for their childhood experiences, their fears, and the protective walls they built without making those walls your permanent home. Understanding someone's psychology should never become an excuse for abandoning your own emotional needs. In fact, the healthier you become, the more you'll realize that compassion and boundaries can exist together. You don't have to stop caring about someone in order to stop chasing them. You don't have to become cold to become strong. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is simply step back and allow another person to take responsibility for their own healing while you continue focusing on yours. And if they eventually come back, you'll be looking at the situation through completely different eyes. Instead of asking whether they finally miss you, you'll ask whether they're capable of creating the kind of relationship you deserve. Instead of being impressed by emotional words, you'll quietly observe consistent actions. Instead of feeling relieved that they're back, you'll ask whether their presence actually brings peace into your life. Those questions only become possible when you've rebuilt your confidence from the inside out, because once you truly know your value, you're no longer searching for someone else's approval to confirm it. You stop seeing love as something you must constantly earn. You begin expecting it to be mutual, stable, respectful, and emotionally safe. Remember, the strongest version of you isn't the one who perfectly masters no contact. It isn't the one who knows exactly what an avoidant is thinking every single day. It's the version of you that no longer measures your worth by another person's ability to love you. That's real freedom. When you reach that point, silence no longer feels like punishment. It becomes peace. Distance no longer feels like rejection. It becomes clarity, and uncertainty no longer controls your emotions because your happiness is no longer dependent on someone else's choices. There will always be people who are emotionally unavailable until they decide to do the difficult work of changing themselves. That journey belongs to them. Your journey is different. Yours is about learning to trust yourself again, honoring your intuition, protecting your emotional well-being, and choosing relationships that allow you to feel secure instead of constantly questioning where you stand. Every experience you've had, no matter how painful, can become part of that growth if you allow it to teach you instead of define you. So if you're watching this while wondering whether your avoidant ex is thinking about you, missing you, or realizing what they lost, take a moment to ask yourself a different question. Are you becoming the kind of person who no longer needs those answers in order to move forward? Because that is the moment everything changes. The day your peace becomes more important than their potential. The day your self-respect becomes stronger than your hope. The day you stop waiting for someone else's transformation and begin fully embracing your own. That is the real victory. Not getting an avoidant to come back, but becoming someone who knows that whether they return or not, your future is no longer determined by their fears, their timing, or their emotional limitations. Your future belongs to you. And when you truly understand that, you stop chasing closure from another person because you realize you've already found something far more valuable. You've found yourself. From that place, every decision becomes clearer, every relationship becomes healthier, and every step forward is guided not by fear of being left behind, but by the confidence that you will never abandon yourself again,